Hello. Today we're going to focus on finding out more about our learners and using this kind of information as a way of planning our teaching. I want to start off with identifying one's learners' needs. Every English course aims, naturally enough, to address the student's learning needs, but finding out what those needs are, conducting what we call a needs analysis, is an essential aspect of designing a language course. Although in any class some students may have different needs from others, a well-designed course aims to address the most common needs the learners face. So we want here to focus on how you can develop a profile of the learning needs of a class of students so that your teaching can better address their needs. In this tip we'll use the example of a reading course, but similar procedures could be used with other skills or other areas of learning. Finding out what kind of reading your students do would be the first step in conducting a needs analysis. And this may involve generating a set of questions that, like the ones that I'm going to share with you now, and finding answers to these questions through needs analysis. For example, we want to start by asking what kinds of out-of-class reading do the students like to do, and what kinds of reading what kind of text do they need to read? How do they read? Do students typically read a text word to word? How do they deal with unfamiliar vocabulary? Can they use skimming and scanning strategies, for example? And can they also read for main ideas, read for making inferences, read and summarize? Can they choose a suitable reading strategy when they read a text? Then we'd like to focus, I think, on what are their main reading difficulties? What are the students' main barriers to a successful reading comprehension ability? For example, do they have a large reading vocabulary? Can they read authentic texts? And we'd also like to focus on the kinds of classroom activities that they enjoy. What kinds of reading activities work best with these students? What kinds of things do they like to read about? How long can they spend on a reading activity before they become bored with it? Do they prefer print-based or reading online or other forms of reading? A number of different forms of procedures can be used to find out about learners' needs, and usually several different methods are used to give a more reliable picture of students' needs. For example, test information on students' reading performance is a good starting point. Also, reports by teachers on typical problems that students face. Perhaps also information from students obtained from interviews and questionnaires. Also, by looking at textbooks for the teaching of reading to see what kinds of skills are typically taught. Information also from books and articles on the topic of teaching reading. Also talking to teachers with different levels of relevant experience in the teaching of reading. You might also get information from learners' diaries and journals in which they write about their experiences with reading. Perhaps you could interview them as well, or observe them in class as they conduct reading activities. Also, it's important, I think, to have an analysis of the kind of text students have to read. What are these texts? What difficulties do they pose? And you might also conduct a case study in which a student's reading experience is monitored over a period of time. So those needs analysis procedures will generate a variety of kinds of information that can be then used to help identify the aims, learning aims that you might want to set for a reading course. For example, the aim may be to develop a reading vocabulary of 3,000 words. Or it might be able to read a text quickly for gist, as well as being able to scan a text quickly for facts and details. Of course, to be able to read with a good level of understanding the main ideas from short articles, to read and identify the purpose of a text, and to be able to distinguish main ideas from supporting details in a text. Perhaps to be able to read and summarize correctly the main information in a short story and article, or to be able to read and make appropriate inferences from a text. So statements of learning outcomes of these, such as these, can be based on the information from a needs analysis. Then you're now in a position to be able to select reading activities to address these course aims. For example, if the aim is to enable students to scan a text quickly for facts and details, an activity could be students are given a text that includes facts and details, and they complete a chart or a graph based on the text. Or perhaps students check whether a set of statements based on the text are true or false. So let's think now about what sort of questions you might ask if you are developing other kinds of courses. For example, a speaking course, a listening course, or a writing course. The same kinds of procedures are in fact required from needs analysis to developing goals and outcomes. Now let's look also at what we can learn from studying examples of students' work. A lot's changed about the way we respond to students' work. I can remember a time when I would return a student's homework with a grade and a few comments and never see it again. Now, when most work is submitted digitally, we have a fantastic resource for analysis, comparison, and professional development. So, studying examples of work students produce can prompt reflection on the teaching practices that led to the work. It can help elucidate problems students may have with different aspects of a course or with the curriculum, and it can also complement information we get from other sources, such as test scores. So let's look now at some ways in which we can collect and review examples of students' work. First of all, consider the role of the activity. What do you think you can learn from studying students' work? Here are some of my thoughts. Can you add any other ideas of your own? Well, we might get information on the difference between exceptional and average performance. When looking at students' work, we might get a sense of the difficulties posed by some learning activities. Or we might be able to detect the impact of teaching or the nature of student thinking. Those are the sort of things you can get by studying examples of students' work. Ideally, you'd work with a group of colleagues who'd like to collect and analyze examples of students' work together. There are lots of different kinds of learning samples you can use for this activity. For example, you might have video records of students completing different kinds of classroom tasks. You might have written work such as essays, student projects or assignments. Perhaps you've even got records of chat room interactions if students are part of a chat room for ESL learners. In fact, any kind of student output could be included, provided it can be used to reflect on the nature of the activity, its intended learning outcomes, what students demonstrate or have learned from it, and the kind of teaching support that preceded or followed the activity. If you do this as a group activity, you can distribute the examples of students' work. Perhaps one member of the group chooses a sample for the group to focus on. And group members in turn can take turns in choosing samples for meetings. During the group meeting, the sample is distributed to the group, and the teacher who provided the sample gives information such as the following: what was the kind of class the work is from? What kind of students were in the class? What was the nature of the assignment students were given? How students were instructed to complete it? What was the teaching that preceded the activity that the students were assigned? At this stage, the purpose behind this activity is not given, nor the outcome that the teacher had expected to obtain, nor does the teacher say whether this is regarded as a good or poor example of what was expected. Group members now reflect on the piece of work they've received without making any judgment or evaluation of it. The focus is on describing what they see or what they can infer from the piece of work, and to try to understand it from the point of view of the student. You can ask questions like these: what information can we extrapolate from the piece of work? Is there anything unusual, unexpected, or interesting about it? What does it suggest about the kind of thinking that the student made use of? To what extent has the student understood the assignment? What difficulties do you think the student encountered in completing the task or activity? The group's thoughts can then be listed on the board for later discussion. Now you can get clarification from the teacher. The teacher who provided the work sample now gives more information, such as background information about the student, why the teacher chose this task or activity, and how he or she would expect a top student to perform on the task. The group then reflects further on the work sample in the light of the further information and asks questions. The next stage involves considering the implication of the student's work or output for classroom practice, and you can ask questions like these. How would you evaluate the quality of the student's work? Could the student have been better prepared for the task? What kind of feedback would be appropriate to give him or her? And what kinds of follow-up activity would be useful?